This video is sponsored by Rocket Money. More on them later. In November, Esquire published one of the most important essays of the year, The Invisible Man by Patrick Fealy. It begins like this.
27 degrees in Porta John. The seat freezing my ass. I'm in the dark with a little flashlight. Chemically treated feces and urine splash onto my anus. The wind howls, shaking the plastic structure. My hands go numb. 3 a.m. Parked in a public lot across the street from the town beach in Westerly, Rhode Island. Just woke up, sleep evasive. It's my first week out here. I poured an iced coffee from my cooler. I'm walking around the front of the Toyota I'm now living in when a car pulls into the lot, comes towards me. I only see headlights illuminating my fatigue and the red plastic party cup in my hand. Must be a cop. Someone gets out and approaches. It is a cop. Young. I'm not afraid exactly, but I'm also not yet used to being homeless.
So in this article, Fealy discusses how he became homeless. Once an acclaimed literary critic, a suddenly onset vigorous mental illness led to debilitating living conditions and expensive care, which eventually brought him to homelessness after over 20 years. He talks about the brutal reality of homelessness, the constant harassment by police when living in one's car, the overall rareness of coming across other humans with compassion for him.
The toughest parts of homelessness have been surviving the poverty and the marginalization, discrimination, and hostility from the non-homeless population. It's usually subtle, this hostility. People pull in to visit the lighthouse or the beach or wherever I am, see me, and immediately park somewhere else, all day long. They are so afraid. I know I look disheveled, but I don't believe there's anything wrong with me intellectually or spiritually. I know I could look better, but I just don't see what the big deal is.
Maybe the most salient parts of this piece are Fealy's engagements with the humanity of the homeless and the imminent crises of homelessness, which the working world shudders to confront and the wealthy all but celebrate. It's the fact that most of us are closer to homelessness than we'd care to admit, and that instead of confronting this fact, we would rather continually distance ourselves in our head from these people, convince ourselves against all reason that they're in their position because they're somehow inferior to us. They chose to be in this position, or they might as well have through sheer lack of competence and lack of care. How else can we explain how we have these luxuries, these necessities? We have housing, but many people do not, and it's not their fault. They didn't do anything to deserve that. Frankly, because nobody deserves that. All human beings deserve basic human rights, right? Well, here's one answer. In most cases, the word homeless is a lie. It's usually a propaganda word for violent drug addicts with severe mental illness. Where to begin? Let's start with some facts. Are you like me, trying to pay the bills, worried about going into further debt like the rest of the country, world perhaps? Well, maybe you need more services that can help you with keeping accounts of your finances. That's why Rocket Money might be the tool for you. Recently, I decided to try a free trial of a streaming service, thinking in my head, okay, after the week is almost over, I'll cancel the subscription if I don't like it. Then a few days came around and surprise, surprise, I forgot about it. Too much to keep up with, you know? Rocket Money is the personal finance app that helps you cancel subscriptions, lower bills, and manage your money better. That's correct. Rocket Money has the ability to negotiate your bills for your internet service, for your phone bill, etc. And it also keeps tabs of different subscriptions that you may have forgotten that you did. Wait, I don't even use that streaming service anymore. I'm glad Rocket Money was here to show me that I'm still spending X amount of money per month on it, which I could be spending on something else. I try to set budgets for myself, but I always struggle because I do it all in my head. And I would love to have an app that could, have that on paper for me, that can monitor my spending by category, that can send me notification when I spend too much on a specific category. Rocket Money can do that. Isn't that great? In addition to me, I have other friends who use Rocket Money and say that it really does help them. And so if you'd like to take a look at this service and see if it'll help you, you should give it a try. Go to rocketmoney.com/Elliot Sang or use the link in the description to get started for free. Thanks to Rocket Money for sponsoring this video. Let's get back to it. Elliot from the future here. So I'm going to add some addendums when I'm dressed like this based on this book, Callous Objects Designs Against the Homeless by Robert Rosenberger. It's from the University of Minnesota Press. It's $10. It's a short book, under 80 pages, and it's excellent. It's an excellent deep dive into the philosophical underpinnings of technologies that are specifically biased against the survival and flourishing of homeless people that also have huge costs for the rest of us, but we'll get to that later. I first want to offer a definition of homelessness based on Rosenberger's work here. It's from page 2, the first note. He writes, homelessness can be defined in many ways. For example, if we look at the 2015 Annual Homeless Assessment Report published by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, we see a terminological distinction made between those who do and do not make use of shelter services. The term unsheltered homeless people is defined generally as people who stay in places not meant for human habitation, such as streets, abandoned buildings, vehicles, or parks. Sheltered homeless people are instead those who stay in emergency shelters, transitional housing programs, or safe havens. Distinctions are also made between those who are temporarily homeless and those who are chronically homeless. So essentially, homelessness as a term has a lot of different connotations, and one can become homeless but not become the type of homeless person that is mostly characterized in this video, mostly what we characterize in our heads when we think of the term homeless, or diminutive terms like hobo, which is to say chronically unhoused, chronically homeless people who often have severe mental disorders and are on the streets for significant periods of time. Again, those are the ones that get counted. Actually, about the counting. So it's hard to get accurate statistics on the homelessness en masse in the US and in many other places. For one, because the method we use to count them, the point-in-time method, is extremely flawed. In this method, sheltered and unsheltered people each are counted on a single day at the end of January. Now you might be wondering, what about all those people that might become homeless once or multiple times through the months of February to December? And I don't know, man. I don't know what to tell you. Homelessness is obviously much more fluid than this. Homelessness is something that can happen to you for weeks or for months, let alone for potentially years. For this and other reasons, it's exceedingly difficult to get reliable statistics on crime, especially violent crime committed en masse by the homeless. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not as willing as one writer for the American Conservative to believe the LAPD when they declare that homeless people commit 31% of all violent crimes in Los Angeles, particularly given, I don't know, the fact that governors of Los Angeles are increasingly stomping out homeless people, and the fact that LAPD has never exactly been the most transparent or honest or benevolent when it comes to how they judge crime, how they see who does it, how they see what crime is violent crime and what crime is, I don't know, policing. Generally, if we look at numerous studies over the years, we can find that homeless people are arrested far more often for non-violent crimes. But given the sensationalized reports of violence committed by the homeless, the violent nature of homeless people, and messages like Elon Musk's, which harken back to similar rhetoric by Ronald Reagan in the 80s, people are being swayed and will continue to be swayed to believe that the homeless are far more violent than they actually are. And that fuels the already high risk of violence against homeless people. We know based on surveys done over the decades, including a recent one by Violence and Victims, that homeless people are disproportionately at risk of being victims of violence compared to being perpetrators of violence. One choice quote, "The prevalence of violence victimization in the homeless population has been estimated to range from 14% to 21%, and approximately 1/3 report having witnessed a physical attack on another person who was homeless. This rate of violence is highly disparate when compared to the general population, in which only 2% report experiencing a violent crime." And so this is what leads the common wisdom that people who study and care for the homeless have been giving us over the years. Homeless people are usually the victims of violence, much less often the perpetrators. Perhaps you'll be more convinced of this, though, if we talk about why this might be, if we talk about why people might become homeless in the first place. So sometimes I post on my community tab different tweets, lately stuff about the homeless. And I remember one particular comment that speaks to something about our perception of the homeless and why they are in the position they are in. Privileged enough to have a fallback, some of these homeless people choose to continue living that way. There are resources that will help them, meanwhile they get back on their feet. I worked a lot with homelessness and they always choose to live off of resources and not get their act together. This is more of a mental health problem than anything. These people were likely abused and in broken families, but resources like counseling will assist them with coping skills and everything they need. I was in their shoes only once too, and once I saw how I lost everything, I determined myself to never go back. But some people never learn and would rather have things handed to them. Privilege to have family is nonsense. I've seen families give everything to these people just for them to continue biting the hand that feeds them. This is one person's account. I know there's a lot of people that feel similarly, and I want to pay attention to a couple different parts of this comment. Notice how this person toggles between saying some of these homeless people and they always chose to live off of resources. There's a very slippery slope that these types of arguments use, where they will in one breath say, hey, some homeless people are bad, and then in another breath say a lot of them are, or they always do this. And that's because they're talking out of their ass, frankly. It's because there's not a really thoughtfully constructed argument there. It's based off of a feeling. Right? It's based off of a feeling that's usually very visceral from talking to certain homeless people, understanding, or just getting a window into some of their experiences. Maybe just the one time you come across a homeless person who's a dickhead, who stepped away from their family for no reason and choose to be homeless, or whatever the case might be in your perception of this event. Based on that one experience, you might feel that way about a lot of homeless people for a long time, and without taking the time to properly unpack it, you end up making these slippery slope arguments like these. Another thing is the way that this person will casually make mention off of how it's a mental health problem and how people are likely abused and in broken families. But they have resources, so that should be enough, right? And nothing fundamentally addresses the question of, are these resources enough? There's just an assumption made that those resources should be enough if you choose to work hard and care enough about getting back on your feet. Which is funny because the whole conversation is about whether the resources are enough, whether we are doing enough, not whether any particular individual homeless person is just too immoral or too unethical to actually make use of them. People make use of shabby resources all the time, and people don't make use of tremendous resources all the time. The focus should not be on what the victim of a bad situation chooses to do when they're in that bad situation, because that has nothing to do with our agency. We can't control individual human beings and tell them exactly what to do. And frankly, if we did, I think we'd be disappointed by how badly we would perform. We should be focused purely on observing people, understanding their stories, and then based on that understanding, making decisions as individuals, as members of a community, to change those circumstances for more and more people. I'll get into this just a little bit more towards the conclusion, but as you can see, this kind of thing does bother me because it feels like something that is worldly and grounded in real experience and it's gritty wisdom, real knowledge of how the world works. But in actuality, it's not wise. And it also undermines all the knowledge and understanding that we have about homelessness and why people become homeless in the first place. It completely downplays how severe these situations are. So here are some causes of homelessness after that ramble. Foster care. According to a study based on stats from the Midwest evaluation of the adult functioning of the former foster youth, between 31% and 46% of our study participants had been homeless at least once by age 26. Different particularities make this more or less possible. There are different findings on how gender affects this. But running away while in foster care, greater placement instability, having a history of physical abuse, engaging in more delinquent behaviors, and having symptoms of a mental health disorder were associated with an increase in the relative risk of becoming homeless. So if you're somebody who suffers from a mental health condition, or if you're somebody who lost your parents at an early age, you are at a very high risk of being homeless, especially compared to the rest of the population. If you've been physically abused as a child, you are at higher risk of becoming homeless. And the reason why should be intuitive, right? Let's say you're abused a lot as a kid and you run away from home. Well, that leaves you homeless. And doesn't the answer in that situation in terms of what we should do about it include how we can stop physical abuse from occurring more and more so that less kids feel the need to run away from home, instead of, as that commenter and many other people like them seem to think, which is let's focus on what the kid should do in that situation, how the kid should act better, the kid should be smarter, the kid should make use of more resources, and just isn't because of something in their decision-making process, something unethical about them, right? I feel like I'm driving that point home too much. What else causes homelessness? Well, cost of living causes homelessness. As it turns out, it's very expensive to buy or rent a home. And it's very expensive to buy, rent a home, and keeping that home, that situation, over long periods of time. Well, then you're just compounding the difficulty over a course of years. So the less people that are able to afford homes, the more people that will be homeless. Does this make sense? I know this is very high level stuff here. Here's some quotes from a Pew article from 2023. A new analysis of rent prices and homelessness in American cities demonstrates the strong connection between the two. Homelessness is high in urban areas where rents are high, and homelessness rises when rents rise. A large body of academic research has consistently found that homelessness in an area is driven by housing costs, whether expressed in terms of rents to income ratios, price to income ratios, or home prices. Further, changes in rents precipitates changes in rates of homelessness. Homelessness increases when rents rise by amounts that low-income households cannot afford. Similarly, interventions to address housing costs by providing housing directly or through subsidies have been effective in reducing homelessness. That makes sense if housing costs are the main driver of homelessness, but not if other reasons are to blame. Studies show that other factors have a much smaller impact on homelessness. It's straightforward, guys. As Akil Hicks writes for Jacobin, there are more empty apartments, homes, and condos in America than there are unhoused people. It is the availability of affordable housing that is the real problem. We'll get into a bit of why that's the case later on. One more note on capitalist crises and affordability. In an article for the Joint Center for Housing Studies of Harvard University, Riordan Frost writes, to help slow the spread of COVID-19 after the onset of the pandemic, homelessness service providers across the country restricted their shelter capacity, and the level of sheltered homelessness fell as a result, from 355,000 people in January 2020 to 326,000 in January 2021. As many of these decongregating measures ended, sheltered homelessness grew to 349,000 people in 2022 and further to 396,000 in 2023. Of course, this restoration of shelter capacity is not the only driver of rising homelessness, since the current level of sheltered homelessness is higher than before the pandemic, and we did not see any complementary decrease in unsheltered homelessness. And this doesn't just affect the homeless. He continues, likewise, other pandemic-era measures that successfully assisted renters and homeowners to remain housed during the tumult of the pandemic are also winding down, including eviction moratoriums, rental subsidies, and income assistance. The loss of these temporary supports is evident. Eviction filings have returned to pre-pandemic levels, and the median amount of income that a renter household has after paying for housing and utilities has hit an all-time low, which leaves people with the lowest incomes increasingly at risk of homelessness. Feel free to share how the pandemic has affected your ability to afford things in the comments section. Just let me know what prices and affordability was like in 2019 and what it's been like over the past couple of years. Let me know how your landlords and local business owners have been responding to it. So what I find fascinating about that passage is that, for one, despite the fact that we know we undercount homeless people every year in the US based on that very flawed system of counting. And despite the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic was a pandemic of a deadly disease that probably killed many people on the streets, we are still seeing statistically an increase in homelessness year after year based on the counts that we can do. Homelessness spiked 12%, 71,000 people in 2023, with more than 650,000 people unhoused, the highest number recorded since data collection began in 2007. Do y'all understand what I'm trying to say? Despite us leaving so many homeless people to die, and pretending many of them don't exist, we are still generating so many new homeless people on a regular basis that it's more than the amount of homeless homeless people we had before, just based on our economic structures. And that has to do with not only the affordability of housing itself, but the affordability of other goods and services, and really necessities, since everything, including our basic necessities, has been financialized. So that's about where we should talk about healthcare. So as you probably know, the state of healthcare in the US is not the best. We're at the point where so many people have had these devastating experiences with the healthcare system, with healthcare insurance companies denying claims, that class solidarity is being built across social media comment sections based on, recent events. So let's just use some stats to put this into a bit more perspective. A refresher for most of you. This is from a 2024 study by Blumenthal et al. For the Commonwealth Fund. The US continues to be in a class by itself in the underperformance of its healthcare sector. The United States is not just an outlier on health system performance, it's an outlier on healthcare spending as well. Essentially, we spend more on healthcare than any other country, and yet we have the worst health outcomes of all comparable countries. Developed countries like Sweden, Germany, Canada, Australia. So this is where we should talk about that Elon Musk tweet again, and also that commenter on my one post, who both made mention of mental illness. And these folks bring it up as if it's something that's an unfortunate affliction, an individual thing that happens to individuals that we can't really do anything about. That's sort of the narrative, right? And because of that, they can't help themselves, they can't help other people, whatever it is that they're trying to argue. The mental illness is severe and they don't treat it, and then they get more and more violent. It's all about them. But the reality is that such a condition of mental illness within homeless people is as strong of an indictment of the system that his billionaire class lords over more than anything else. Because where do these mental illnesses or these addictions that people suffer from come from? We know that they have significant linkage to trauma and correlate strongly to marginalized populations who have experienced systemically produced traumatic events. Take a look at the numbers in terms of how gender, sexuality, race, ethnic group, and of course, class line up with these afflictions. In a 2021 Elsevier article, Levin et al. Write, exposure to trauma is considered a risk factor for the development of addictive disorders. Both direct and indirect exposure to trauma were found to be significantly related with risk of addiction. I should also bring up at this point the work of Gabor Mate, including his book In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, which tackles the systemic traumatic origins of addiction, while his newer book, The Myth of Normal, illustrates how susceptible we all are towards different disorders and diseases, including autoimmune issues, based on exposure to trauma and inability to heal within given circumstances. And this is also where I should make mention of the judgment that people have about homeless people, the constant comments that you'll hear, oftentimes from members of your family, when you feel bad for homeless people, when you want to give them money on the train or on the street, and somebody tells you, they're just going to spend that on drugs, or they're just going to spend that on alcohol. Patrick Fealy actually has a powerful quote in his Esquire piece. You'll recall that's the one where he talks about his experience with homelessness, and he writes,
Alcohol is the buffer a sensitive soul needs to withstand the crimes of a race, the human race, that has proved itself ungrateful and homicidal.
And this is all to say that I thought we cared about mental health, right? We know that mental health issues and mental illness is more common than we think. And we know that it emerges from traumas and stresses wrought by systemic issues. The poor family dealing with addiction, the abuse rampant in certain families, the experience of racial abuse and sexual abuse, etc., etc. Things that our systems don't do a good enough job of addressing. And in the US healthcare system in particular, these things are also extremely expensive to treat. And often they are treated with prescribed medications that can cause further addictions, and therapy that's often more focused on adjusting a person's behavior than getting to the root of their issues. So you'll be shocked to find out that there's a lot of evidence suggesting that healthcare costs are also a significant cause of homelessness. From the Peterson Foundation, in 2022, US healthcare spending reached $4.5 trillion, which averages to $13,493 per person. By comparison, the average cost of healthcare per person in other wealthy countries is less than half as much. From a UCSF study, Dan Treglia and colleagues found that in the period 2009 to 15, the use of acute care, including hospitalization, increased in the year prior to entry into homelessness among a sample of New York City shelter users, suggesting that health crises may precipitate homelessness. People experiencing homelessness sometimes report that health crises, either their own or those of a household member, precipitated their housing loss, in many cases directly through income loss. You get sick, you get into an accident, maybe at the workplace, maybe at home. You go to the hospital, you're charged exorbitant amounts of money. You can't pay it off. You lose your house. Patrick Fealy is one such example of a person whose rapid onset bipolar disorder, which caused incredible pain and incapacitation, eventually led to his inability to continue working his esteemed job.
In 1997, I was a 29-year-old award-winning art critic and journalist when I was stricken by a violent and disabling onset of manic depression, bipolar 1, rapid cycling mixed state, the most severe form of the genetic disorder and often fatal by suicide. My psychiatrist actually said to me, "You are the worst manic depressive I have ever seen." Together, we developed a unique cocktail of 8 medications that enables me to function and has kept me alive for 27 years.
His eventual condition, deteriorating into the 2010s, was capped off by a horrific tooth infection, which was poorly treated by a dentist who was trained to deny him good care because he considered this homeless-looking person a potential drug seeker. The dentist told him that this tooth issue wasn't an abscess and prescribed him antibiotics and ibuprofen. The pain and disorientation became unbearable.
By the 3rd day of antibiotics, my chin had ballooned. I pressed it. It was hard. A stream of pus shot out horizontally and hit the rearview mirror. My jaw was infected. Soon after, I saw my internist and shared the story of my dental experience. He said it was an abscess.
Patrick Fealy is far from the only person whose health conditions were caused by systemic issues, left uncared for by systemic issues, and eventually led to his homelessness. And he was a white man who had worked up through society, had been educated, and had a well-paying, esteemed job. What if he didn't have that? What if he didn't have as much support from his family? What if he was belonging to a marginalized group? What if he had experienced severe poverty and homelessness from an early age? What if he was Jordan Neely?
Wow. These 6 minutes will change everything for both men.
So let's just get this straight. Anxiety about homelessness, about the mentally ill among us, leads to death. The fear causes us to create this cognitive dissonance. We celebrate this death as if it's necessary, even though the facts tell us otherwise. And that's how we get situations like this society-wide celebration of Daniel Penny for killing a homeless man on the NYC subway.
The Instagram posts from nutbag people, which I was sent in the commercial break earlier, crazy. Like, he's cute, and people celebrating this is a sickness. Honestly, it's so disappointing. And up next, the other big news out of New York, Daniel Penny. A lot of people think he's a hero, and tonight he's not guilty. My take next.
Your corporate overlords want you to believe that young military veteran being paraded around by the Trump administration, Daniel Penny, is a hero of sorts, that he was justified taking the life of a poor person who did not physically attack anyone on a subway, but taking similar action against the CEO who destroys tons of lives through his position at the top of a health insurance company. That's not okay, though. I lived in New York City for over 20 years of my life. I understand the fear of being harmed by a person having an episode on the train, even though there's very little to indicate that you'll actually be harmed, especially given the resources you have at your disposal to, I don't know, for instance, change your train car if you feel uncomfortable by a homeless person on it. Regardless, I do understand the fear, but I can't understand, nor can I tolerate, the lack of care and empathy for that person. Jordan Neely and his mother, Christy, stayed in numerous shelters across NYC as she trained to become a paralegal. When Neely was 14, his mother was murdered by an abusive partner, found stuffed in a suitcase on the side of a Bronx highway. He would spend the rest of his childhood in foster care, becoming a b-boy at a young age, but developing schizophrenia, PTSD, and major depression. He became one of the many foster children forced into homelessness, subsisting on dancing on subways and streets, doing a Michael Jackson impression. But the lack of resources and constant trauma he'd experienced did a number on him. His behavior became increasingly erratic, culminating in an assault of an old woman in 2021. He was detained at Rikers and imprisoned for 2 years before being sent to an inpatient facility, which he walked out of in February of 2023. On May 1st of that year, he barely got on an F train from 2nd Avenue, a very commercial area in the East Village, at night, screaming that he was hungry, thirsty, needed a job. He said he was ready to go to jail, ready to die, and the context maybe for the people sitting by would have been that he was potentially going to harm somebody, which I understand. But given the fact that we know he escaped from an inpatient facility and was likely to be incarcerated once he was caught, we can tell that that's probably not the full context. Regardless, he was restrained by one Daniel Penny, placed in a rear naked choke, and strangled to death. Penny continued to strangle him nearly a minute after he'd gone limp, as passengers yelled, "You're going to kill him." And he did. I don't care how you judge the morality of Jordan Neely, of someone who went through that much trauma and debilitation. That part isn't important. What a victim of a horrible situation does is not nearly as important as what the circumstances were that created that horrible situation and how to change that. I don't care to act like Jordan Neely was a saint. None of us are. Many of you would do far worse if you were in his position. And if your concern lies with the threat people like him pose to society, then instead of getting into some asinine moral conversation about who's a good person and who's a bad one, then we need to be discussing and focusing on acting towards changing the system that causes these things to happen, that causes people to go through these situations. We need to be focused on how the system severely failed him and thus failed all of us. Because when any one of us is failed by the system, we all are. When people are put in desperate positions, unable to receive basic human necessities like shelter and food, we become much less capable of helping ourselves and those around us. And yet we are systemically putting more and more people in those positions at the whims of billionaires who could pay for all of us to have what we need, and being socially trained to celebrate this inequality. In the US, both parties are collaborating. Shocker again. They're working tooth and nail to drive more people into homelessness and then to punish them for being homeless. Jordan Neely is far from the only person to have been killed in recent years, basically due to being homeless. Some were killed by police escalating altercations with them for committing heinous crimes, such as jaywalking. New York City, my home, is increasingly becoming more and more violent and police dominated. One of numerous cities in the country wherein encampments of homeless people are being destroyed. Eric Adams, mayor of NYC, and Gavin Newsom, governor of California, are two Democrats, popular newer faces of the supposed bleeding heart liberal party, and yet are also two of the most vicious politicians in our country against the homeless. And these things are not just happening at city or state levels, they're happening at federal and judicial levels. Did you hear about what the Supreme Court voted on recently? From UC Berkeley News, in a landmark ruling that will have significant nationwide ramifications, particularly in California, the US Supreme Court on Friday cleared the way for local governments to more aggressively enforce camping bans and punish homeless people for sleeping outside, even when shelter space is lacking. What do you think that's gonna do to people?
I see a page 1 story on the homeless in the Providence Journal. I pick it up and read. A small group of homeless people have been living in tents on vacant public property. Residents in the nearby neighborhood have been complaining. They must be concerned. The article says that the mayor's policy is to break up every encampment that forms. One of the homeless interviewed says she doesn't know where she will go.
Hi, Black Dickie's shirt Elliot back here for the hostile architecture section. We're going to talk about the Callous Objects book again. That's why I slapped it at the screen and then I just dropped it. We're going to talk about pages 20 to 23 first, because there are many instances of technologies, of designs in our public spaces that are extremely exclusionary and often really violent towards homeless people. And I know that sounds like an exaggeration of some sort, but let me give you a particular example that can leave no doubt as to why I would say that. So on page 20, he talks about the spikes. What do I mean by the spikes? So in June 2014, and also bear in mind, this book is from 2017. So in June 2014, somebody posted on Twitter a picture of these chrome spikes that are outside a London apartment building. This is the picture that's in the book. The purpose of these spikes is, as Rosenberger writes, to prevent people from using the area as a place to sleep. Literal Super Mario Brothers stuff. Spikes on the ground so that you can't sleep on there. And this situation was particularly resonant or eye-opening for a lot of people. It even got up to the political sphere, where the mayor of London at that time, Boris Johnson, known for being a really good dude who cares about the poor, tweeted, "Spikes outside Southwark housing developments to deter rough sleeping are ugly, self-defeating, and stupid. Developers should remove them ASAP." And then the mayor of Montreal hopped on board, as Rosenberger says, and basically supported that. So this became this viral thing, and the spikes were removed. But the thing about the spikes is that they are particularly eye-catching. Let's say. Rosenberger writes, "In stark terms, they communicate the message that unhoused people are not welcome." And getting those spikes removed, you might say, was a victory that took place almost a decade ago. In fact, more than a decade ago, because I forget what year it is. And so perhaps this is a sign of a larger trend in terms of how we talk about how cities are designed. The thing about the reaction, though, was that it wasn't just because the spikes were anti-homeless. It's because they were an eyesore. It's because of how starkly they communicated that message of anti-homelessness. And the thing about many other designs is that they are not so stark. They don't catch your eye quite as much. And in fact, we can even interpret them as part of our day-to-day experience, very normal, but in fact have the same kinds of origins. For instance, an example that comes up a lot in the book, the dividers on seats. Seat dividers on benches at bus stops, on benches on train platforms. In New York City, they're very common. Those are there because homeless people sleep on those benches, and the city wants to prevent that. And so in order to do so, they create these little ridges that make it so that it is really uncomfortable to sleep on those. Now, this book gets into so much great philosophizing about just, first of all, this concept of multi-stability and the concept of technology, in a sense, being inherently purposeful, inherently biased, which is something that we don't like to think. We either have, as Rosenberger talks about in the book, this determinist view of technology. Technology is making the world better, no need to think about it. Or technology is making the world worse, no need to think about it. You know, iPhone bad, Unabomber type stuff. Or we use an instrumentalist type of philosophical thinking, which is to say they're just instruments. They have no bias, they are not negative nor positive. The only thing that determines whether they can be used in a negative or positive way is the human behavior behind them. Now, this doesn't really make sense either, because why would the seat dividers be there? The development of this particular tool, this particular thing that mediates our experience with everyday life, that makes it so that we can travel, or makes it so that we have somewhere to rest before we travel. Why are those seat dividers there if not for the express purpose of stopping people from sleeping? Rosenberger writes, "We must develop a way to understand objects like the bench as capable of participating in large-scale collective ends. It is crucial that we understand them to be things open to certain uses, closed to others, and amenable to concrete alteration by different social forces advancing different political objectives." And this is where the term hostile architecture comes from. You might have heard of this term. It's the title of the section. Architecture of urban spaces, which are supposed to be spaces that are, usable and convenient for all the people in the city, are actually designed with different stabilities, as Rosenberger says, or different express purposes to be rested upon by different people in the city. There's a dominant stability, or the particular intention and usage that is designed by the people who are dominant in that field, dominant in that area, dominant in the capital behind that technology. And then there are multiple stabilities. So the dominant stability of your average bench at a bus stop prior to these changes was to use it to sit so you can wait for the bus. But homeless people would use these places as roofed places to sleep because they have those little booths around them with like the adverts on them. You know what I'm talking about. But they're long enough for them to curl up and sleep on. And when police came up to them, they could say, hey, I'm waiting for the bus. And that would give them plausible deniability. Now, a lot of you might have the idea that that's illegal or it's wrong because that's not what the bench is supposed to be there for. And everybody should just use the bench for what it's used for what the original purpose of the bench is. And to that I say that's the dominant stability. And what is that dominant stability if not the intentions of the rich people who design these cities, who run these cities, who dominate these cities, who exploit these cities and all the people in them? Why is it that there should only be one way that we use everything? Rosenberger gives the example of fire hydrants as being a classic case of something that is designed for one purpose, to put out fires, but in poor neighborhoods and cities in summertime, they're, known in like all of our canon in terms of 20th century, 21st century movies about American cities as things that get opened up when it gets too hot and people can't afford air conditioning so that people can cool off with the cold water. Life is full of these things. And what different people with different competing interests do in public spaces to make sure that that public space is dominated by one particular group and the views and desires of that particular group is that they continually change the architecture in those cities so that it favors those people and those groups. And having homeless people visible in your city who have the rights to be sleeping on benches because, God forbid, they have a place to sleep, that's a bad thing. Why? Because it pushes away capital, because it makes it so that more and more people have to reckon even just with a different stability, even just with people of a different group who might have different intentions and different needs. When you don't see homeless people there, and you don't have any idea that the architecture around you is designed to ward off homeless people, you are further and further convinced that those homeless people are not there, that there is no problem with homelessness, and that people are all basically in the same experiential realm. They all experience the same things. We're all going to work. We all are in the same tax brackets or have the same philosophies and intentions. And that's not real harmony, is it? It's not really getting rid of a problem to hide it or make it as difficult to appear as possible. You don't fix a problem with a sinking ship by plugging in holes and making it look like it's part of the wall. That's not really the way that it works, because the problem is still the force of the water pushing in from the outside. And making it look a certain way does not equate to fixing the problem. So have you ever heard of Penn Station in New York City? Because on page 29, Rosenberger talks about this as a particular example of a place that for many years, homeless people were able to use to find shelter when they are unsheltered. He describes the work of Mitchell Dunier in the book Sidewalk, and says that Dunier explains that as a sprawling interior complex of restaurants, stores, newsstands, and waiting areas, Penn Station afforded the unhoused a complete livable ecosystem. Restaurants often donated food to the homeless. That's a good thing, right? Restaurants donating food to people who need it. There were tons of different alcoves and seating areas and places that homeless people could sleep. And there were a ton of tourists coming in because it was a place where people from other parts of the city and people from outside the city and people from outside New York would come on different buses, trains, etc. The building of Pennsylvania Station is climate controlled, as Rosenberger notes. So you don't have to worry about suffering and dying in the cold or in the searing heat. Now, of course, this was bad and needed to stop. Homeless people and people who are very poor need to not have places in the city that can double as places for them to survive. They need to go to shelters, which I don't even have time in this video to get into how bad the sheltering system is and why that is. But in the mid-1990s, Amtrak officials decided we have to crack down on all this homelessness. And so there's actually an interview that Dunier in this book does with a Amtrak homeless outreach officer. This is a quote from that officer. "We used to see people sleeping on this brick ledge every night," referring to a particular one. "I told them I wanted a barrier that would prevent people from sleeping on both sides of this ledge. This is an example of turning something around to get the desired effect." The way that Penn Station is now, it's brutal. The homelessness problem that, seem to have gone away once you magically make it really hard for homeless people to be there, did not go away. They find other establishments that they can house themselves in for temporary periods of time before those are cracked down on. The homeless people become in increasingly destitute and desperate states. They disperse across different parts of the city, etc. So no, it did not fix the homelessness problem in New York City to do this. You know what would fix the homelessness problem? Giving everybody houses. So why don't we do that? We have all this housing available, and we know that these things that are happening to these homeless people are terrible, and we want to end homelessness. So why don't we end it by giving them housing, by giving them far more resources? Why are we doing this? Is it somehow better for the economy? No, of course not. In fact, it actually worsens our economy. From Homeless Voice 2021, it costs taxpayers $31,065 a year to criminalize a single person suffering from homelessness through enforcement of unconstitutional anti-panhandling laws, hostile architecture, police raids of homeless encampments, and just general harassment. The cost of providing them supportive housing, $10,051 per year. The way we're taught about the economy on a fundamental level makes this kind of policy counterintuitive. We know that economies and countries do better when more people are educated, when more people have housing, when more people are healthy, and when more people have enough money to consume, to buy products which contribute to the economy, right? So why are we doing this? Shouldn't we be building social safety nets that help build a strong consumer base for the economy? Isn't that how capitalism works? Don't people want more money? Yes and no. Capitalism is ultimately a system based in exploitation. There's no two ways around it. As Eric Olin Wright posits in his essay Class and Occupation, exploitation is defined as a relationship within which the people in one social location are able to appropriate at least part of the products of labor of people in another social location. In order to maintain that dynamic, capitalists have to have control over money capital, over physical capital, and labor. That means they not only have to have the access and the ability to control money and resources and people, but they need to have that ability to control the social dynamic at play that makes it so that those people especially don't have ways to take the power away from them. That means they not only have to have money and resources, and they not only have to have a lot of laborers that they employ. They need to have control over a system's hierarchy so that people remain in exploited social positions, which continually forces them to contribute to the economy as the capitalists see fit. That's why a simple analysis of the world as being rich versus poor and capitalists versus workers is basically right on a lot of fronts, but kind of unhelpful when it comes to analyzing specific situations. In reality, dividing classes more and more, especially the lower classes, into different stratas allows for there to be a continual sense of hierarchy that one has to maintain their place within and work to avoid dropping within. There are small business owners and there are more autonomous workers that get high salaries, right? Your fancy doctors and lawyers of the world, and they're not capitalists, but they have more power than your average wage laborer. So the wage laborer can look at them and say, I want to be in those classes. I want to get to that stage next. And anything that's going to stop me from getting to that position is something that I will have to be against. Moreover, they look at the people underneath them in that hierarchy and they say, I can't go there. Moreover, the more capitalists make money and the more they develop technology, the less and less need they have for wage laborers. This is what happens in the factories. This is what's happening now when it comes to AI, replacing certain labor. This creates and maintains and often increases what we call a surplus amount of laborers, or the term Industrial Reserve Army. The Industrial Reserve Army has three forms itself, as explained by Australian social economics professor Jock Collins. The floating form corresponded to those workers who were displaced or mobile between jobs from the centers of modern industry because of technical change and the concentration and centralization of capital. So people who are between jobs, who work in a certain profession but have a hard time maintaining that from month to month, often have to work in the gig economy. Then there's the stagnant form, related to those whose employment was irregular, such as the itinerant or seasonal worker, people whose line of work is only really viable in a specific season of the year. Then there's the latent form, which is composed of workers displaced from the agricultural sector by the growing encroachment of the capitalist mode of production and improved technology. It's no longer viable to do small-scale farming and have that maintain your way of living. And then crucially underneath that, we have the lumpen proletariat, or the lowest sediment of the reserve surplus population. This included people past the age of labor, those mutilated or sick, often the victims of industry, as well as the criminal element. So important to bring up that often these people who are mutilated and sick are very directly the victims of industry, as Collins writes. Somebody who gets mutilated from a work-related incident is a classic example. But as we talk about things like mental illness and different types of autoimmune disorders that develop from trauma, you can see how there are so many different ways that our capitalist system produces trauma and as such makes people sicker. And the more sick that people become, the closer they are to developing a very debilitating disease or a disability. And the more that we have people who have these debilitating diseases, conditions, and disabilities, the more we have people who are barely hanging on, and the more we have people who are homeless. And then, of course, there's the financialization of everything that comes as part of this process. The more money the capitalists make, the more they look for different realms in which to gain more and more profit from it, especially since, for instance, the Fordist mode of production, the old school factories from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, don't make as much profit as they used to. So then they open up realms like housing and healthcare to be places where finance dominates. Look around you. Look at how much land, how many buildings are taken up by corporations whose owners are nowhere near this area that you live in. In Urban Warfare, Housing Under the Empire of Finance, Raquel Rolnick tackles how financialization has created a world in which corporate digital transactions and credit scores determine who deserves a home and not, for instance, the fact that everybody deserves a home. There's a great quote that she has about home ownership and this concept of home ownership that we've developed, especially in the past 20, 30 years. This fundamental thing that helps people from the working class become more affluent, that everybody is seeking to achieve, owning a home. And this in itself is a mechanism that allows for finance capital to increase their profits, but also makes people more and more conservative and reactionary, more and more inclined to focus on their own profit making and less on the community. Citizens are replaced by consumers and players in capital markets. It is in this sense that we may affirm that this housing finance elixir acts like a political drug. Housing has become one of the main traps to control us. We're constantly burned out, constantly working, constantly trying to produce more for capitalists that will extract profit from what we produce, while we don't get nearly as much of the profit that they do, if we get any of it, which we don't. Hustling just to afford a home, a basic human right, which costs way more than it needs to because the owner of it, or the bank that loans us ownership of it, needs to make a profit. Meanwhile, homeless people represent to us all of our fears. We see our faces in them. We see what can happen to us if we don't play the game, and if we don't play the game as well as possible. And because of that psychic toll, we're constantly convincing ourselves that there must be something wrong with them fundamentally. This is why we're so cruel towards them. We're cruel towards things that make us feel insecure.
The definition of homeless is that we have no home. Many of you could be where we are, on the street, but for some simple and not uncommon twist of fate. This is part of your rejection, this fear that it could be you. You deny that reality because it is too horrific to contemplate, therefore you must deny us. And the moneyed reject us because they know they create us, that we are a consequence of their impulse to accumulate more than they need, rooted in a fear of life and death that comes with it. Nothing good comes of fear, only destruction, and America has become a society of fear. Much of that fear cultivated to divide and control, no place to go. If I think therefore I am is true, we are people who are. We are, and we stand on this ground. If you deny us ground, you are denying us our I am. Isn't that negation of our existence? We are here, and we are you, and we are yours.
If, as Gabor Mate and tons of health research indicates to us, stress makes us more sick, then we're constantly being put on a path to become more sick and more likely to become disabled, just based off of our fear of becoming homeless, sick, or disabled. By neglecting the homeless and by neglecting to help each other, we make things worse. We make our fears become closer and closer to reality. For this conclusion, I just want to show you a couple of the comments that I've received from people that talked about their own experiences from homelessness. The only thing keeping me from being homeless right now is my mother. I am disabled and terrified of the future when I inevitably no longer have her support. I was raised homeschooled in a very religious community. Shortly before I graduated, I was outed as gay. Then from 18 to 23, I was on and off homeless, basically shunned by my family and community. It was horrible. I turned to drugs eventually and developed a fentanyl addiction, which was the worst thing that ever happened to me. My estranged aunt, a lesbian, just now found out what had happened. She was furious and managed to get someone to give her my phone number, hit me up, and bought me a ticket to fly out and live with her until I can get back on my feet. I've been here for 2 weeks. It feels surreal. I don't think I'll ever be able to forget the last 5 years. You might think that these people are exaggerating or that they're making up their stories. But I guarantee you, the more you look into this, the more you learn about the stories of actual homeless people, the more that this reality, that we are far closer to them than we'd care to admit, is undeniable. And that we need to learn how to work with them, how to become more generous towards them, how to participate in mutual aid, how to participate in organizing to vote against these policies that continue to eradicate their populations and eradicate our hope for a fearless future. We need to learn how to do better, and we can't give up on hope because that just makes it worse. Check out our other videos in terms of what you can do to make the world a better place, including one from just after the US election. Feel free to join our Patreon, help contribute at least $1 a month, and you can get access to bonus content like interviews with creators like FD Signifier and Zoe B. Thanks for watching.